The sound you're about to hear has been buried beneath centuries of incense and hymns. Fingernails scratching against Vatican marble, the frantic gasps of women crawling on all fours, and the muffled laughter of the most powerful man in Christendom, Christ's own representative on earth. October 31, 1501. All Hallows' Eve. While monks prayed in Latin just outside heavy wooden doors, inside, under flickering candlelight, the papal apartments transformed into a theater of degradation. It was called the Banquet of Chestnuts. Not by rumor, not by slander, but by the Pope's own master of ceremonies, who recorded every obscene detail in his private diary. Imagine it, 50 courtesans, stripped of dignity, competing like livestock for prizes of gold. They crawled across the marble floors, gathering chestnuts scattered by servants, while Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ, raised a jeweled goblet and watched. The game was simple. The women would be rewarded not for chastity or holiness, but for the number of acts of pleasure they could endure before collapsing. The Pope himself presided, applauding their obedience as if this corruption were some twisted sacrament. This was no myth, no Protestant invention. This was recorded fact, kept in ink by a man who stood at the very heart of power. And here's the truth they don't want you to know: the Vatican was never just a house of God. It was an empire of flesh, blood, and power. Behind its sacred walls, faith was currency, and desire was the true altar. The man who wore the papal crown that night was not merely corrupt, he was the embodiment of institutional rot. But how did it come to this? How did a boy born on dusty Spanish roads rise to a throne higher than kings, only to twist it into the world's most decadent brothel? That is the hidden story. A story of forbidden knowledge, of men who understood that weakness could be harvested like grain, and that faith itself could be weaponized. The moment Rodrigo Borgia, later Pope Alexander VI, stepped foot in Rome, he saw not a holy city but a market. Every bowed head was a transaction, every whispered prayer a vulnerability, every ritual a lever waiting to be pulled. And tonight, you're not just going to hear about him, you're going to see the patterns of control that never died. Because this story isn't only history. It's a warning. Picture Rome in 1449. The eternal city was crumbling, not just in stone but in spirit. The church was no longer the humble guardian of souls, it was the world's most powerful bank, empire, and court combined. Into this city walked a young man named Rodrigo Borgia, trailing behind his uncle, a Spanish cardinal. Dust clung to his boots, but his eyes burned with hunger. And from the first moment, he saw what no priest dared admit: the Vatican wasn't sacred ground, it was the most dangerous marketplace on earth. The Romans mocked him for his accent, sneered at the foreign nephew who dared to step among their marble halls. They thought him an outsider, a provincial wolf sniffing at the gates of their banquet. But Rodrigo carried something sharper than noble blood. He carried the instinct of a predator. When he attended Mass at St. Peter's, he didn't look at the altar with reverence. His gaze swept the crowd like a merchant weighing goods. Every bowed head, every trembling prayer, every guilty eye, he was cataloging human weakness like an alchemist gathering ingredients. This is the first truth you must see: power does not rise through holiness. It rises through the exploitation of desire, fear, and shame. Rodrigo saw drunk cardinals stumbling out of chambers, bishops with secret mistresses, priests who gambled away tithes on dice games. But where others gossiped, he took notes. Every weakness became a seed of leverage. Every sin became a weapon to be unsheathed later. When his uncle rose to the papacy, Rodrigo's ascent began. At just 25, he was elevated to cardinal, not through decades of devotion, but because of blood and loyalty. The Italian elites were horrified. Centuries of tradition shattered overnight, replaced by nepotism so blatant it reeked of open mockery. But Rodrigo wasn't ashamed. He smiled. He laughed. He studied. And behind that laughter was calculation. They thought they were corrupting him with their vices. In truth, they were training their executioner. He understood something terrifying: that the Church's corruption was not its weakness, but its strength. Because corruption is predictable. Desire can be bought. Guilt can be silenced. Fear can be weaponized. And by the time these men realized they were teaching a Spaniard how to master their game, it was already too late. Rodrigo Borgia was no longer a student. He was a predator. And the Vatican itself, this labyrinth of marble, incense, and hypocrisy, was his hunting ground. By the time Rodrigo Borgia claimed the throne of St. Peter, the game was over. Rome had been conquered not by armies but by whispers, secrets, and bribes. The conclave that elected him in 1492 was a theater of corruption, votes bought with gold, positions promised like poker chips, enemies silenced with poison or the threat of eternal damnation. The man who now called himself Pope Alexander VI didn't just inherit power, he purchased it, bartered for it, and bled for it. And the world would pay the price. Alexander understood the truth few dare whisper even today: religion is the most potent form of psychological control. Because faith doesn't just bind a man's body, it shackles his mind, his guilt, his fear of eternity. What king can command his subjects beyond the grave? None. But the Pope could. And Alexander wielded that terror like a blade. Behind every sermon, behind every blessing, lurked the same message: obey, or burn forever. Yet while he wore the robes of Christ's vicar, he lived as a warlord. The Vatican treasury flowed like a river into his pockets, and his appetites were insatiable. Not just for gold, not just for land, but for flesh. He paraded mistresses through the holy halls without shame, fathering children openly while priests preached chastity to the masses. And those children became chess pieces in his greater game. Marriages brokered like treaties, alliances forged in bedrooms, betrayals sealed with a kiss. But here is the part that should chill you: Alexander VI didn't merely indulge. He engineered. The infamous banquet of chestnuts was not a drunken accident, but a ritual of dominance. He turned sex into spectacle, sin into celebration, corruption into liturgy. Why? Because when morality itself is inverted, when shame is broken, when the sacred becomes profane, the people under your rule no longer resist. They surrender. And Rome did surrender. The nobles bowed, the clergy whispered, the people gawked, but no one dared defy him. Because he had proven something that echoes even now: the greatest prison is not built of stone. It is built of belief. And if you can rewrite belief, you can own the soul itself. This is the hidden inheritance of power, never spoken of in your schools, never admitted in your churches. Alexander VI was not an aberration. He was a revelation. The mask slipped, and for a moment the world saw what power truly is: control of the flesh, the gold, and the mind. That if you want to understand Alexander VI, you must understand his children. Because the Pope of corruption was not just a father in secret, he was a dynast in plain sight. His bloodline was his true army, and he wielded them like blades. Cesare, his ruthless son, became the iron fist of the Borgia name. Lucrezia, his daughter, became its poisoned velvet glove. Together, they formed a dynasty of manipulation that would haunt Europe for generations. Cesare was no ordinary prince. Groomed first as a cardinal, he abandoned the cloth for the sword, becoming a mercenary commander who carved Italy with fire and steel. Villages burned, noble families vanished, and the streets of Rome whispered his name with both awe and terror. He was his father's shadow, enforcing with blood what Alexander dictated with gold. Where the Pope's decree failed, Cesare's blade persuaded. And every drop of blood he spilled was sanctified beneath the sign of the cross. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became a tool of diplomacy. Married and remarried, shifted like a pawn across Europe, she was far more than a victim. Her charm, her beauty, her intelligence were weapons. Behind banquets and veils, she became a spider weaving webs of seduction and betrayal, a living symbol that even the Holy Family itself was for sale. Poison was her rumor, but influence was her truth. Together, Father, Son, and Daughter ruled like a trinity of corruption, a parody of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And here lies the most chilling revelation: the Church was not merely corrupt, it was engineered as a dynasty of control. Faith kept the masses kneeling. Blood secured the power behind closed doors. Violence maintained order. Pleasure ensured loyalty. The Vatican became less a holy sanctuary than a fortress of control, where every avenue of human weakness, lust, fear, greed, devotion, was harvested and weaponized. Now pause here. If you've been listening this far, you are no longer just a viewer. You are stepping across a line most men never dare approach. You've seen how institutions twist morality, how power feeds on obedience. And if you're ready to reject their chains, I want you to leave a mark, right now. Comment the phrase, "I break the chains, I break the chains." Write it twice. Not just for me, but for you. To anchor the moment you stopped being a spectator and started becoming dangerous to the systems that feed on your silence. Because this isn't entertainment. It's transformation. And the deeper we go, the less you'll ever see the world the same way again. By the end of the 15th century, Rome was no longer the holy capital of Christendom, it was a stage for decadence, violence, and manipulation. The mask of sanctity had slipped, and what stood behind it was the cold machinery of power. Pope Alexander VI didn't just exploit the Church's corruption, he revealed its design. And if you see clearly, you'll realize this machinery never disappeared. Think about it. Religion had become the perfect weapon of control. Every man fears death, but the Church claimed to own eternity. Heaven and hell were not simply metaphors, they were currencies. Pay indulgences, and your sins are forgiven. Pay the Pope, and your enemies are damned. Do you see the genius? Gold turned into salvation. Obedience turned into eternity. And Alexander turned both into leverage. But behind the rituals of incense and choir voices, there were rituals far darker. The Vatican was filled with whispers of hidden chambers, of orgiastic ceremonies masked as feasts, of wine that flowed redder than blood. While peasants begged for crumbs of grace, the papal palace echoed with laughter, feasts, and flesh. It wasn't just hypocrisy, it was inversion. The sacred became profane, the profane became sacred. This wasn't weakness. This was design. The banquet of chestnuts was no anomaly. It was a message. To humiliate women, to defile the symbol of chastity, to turn purity into performance, it broke the spine of morality itself. Once broken, obedience became easy. Because if the highest holy office could desecrate the sacred so openly, what resistance could remain among the flock? When truth is inverted, when light is mocked, men stop trusting themselves. And when you no longer trust yourself, you surrender to the system. And here is the darkest truth: Alexander VI didn't invent this. He only made it visible. Every institution that survives centuries does so not through purity, but through control. Strip away the robes, the chants, the marble walls, and you will find the same engine that powered Rome under the Borgias, the harvesting of weakness, the manipulation of fear, and the ownership of belief. This is why his story is so dangerous. It doesn't stay locked in the 15th century. It stares back at us like a mirror. Because the world today still runs on the same fuel: desire, guilt, obedience, and silence. And until you recognize it, you remain a pawn in their banquet. Power built on corruption is never eternal. Even the strongest predators bleed. For Pope Alexander VI, the cracks began not from morality, not from revolt, but from the very system he had mastered. Poison whispered through chalices, daggers waited in shadows, and the same currency of fear and betrayal he used on others turned inward upon him. The hunter had taught the world how to hunt. His enemies were everywhere. Nobles whose lands Cesare had stolen. Cardinals stripped of their wealth. Foreign kings disgusted yet envious of his audacity. But Alexander had made one fatal error: he believed that terror itself was loyalty. That men controlled by fear would never betray him. But fear is not loyalty. Fear is only waiting for a stronger hand to cut the chain. And when whispers of his death spread through Rome, few wept, and many celebrated. The irony is cruel. The Pope who had turned indulgences into a gold mine, who had desecrated the sacred with banquets of lust, who had corrupted faith itself, was undone by the very tools he used: deception, greed, and poison. Some say he drank from a cup meant for another. Others say he was poisoned deliberately by rivals. But the truth is simpler: he was consumed by the system he embodied. Yet here is what should disturb you most. His death did not end the corruption. His fall did not cleanse the church. The machine did not break, it adapted. Because institutions built on control are not the creation of one man. They are ancient, self-repairing, hydra-headed beasts. Cut down one pope, and another will rise. Remove one dynasty, and another will claim the throne. The machinery of control never disappears, it only changes its mask. And this is the lesson most men miss: villains are not aberrations. They are revelations. They show you what the system looks like without its disguise. Alexander VI stripped away the illusion of holiness and revealed the Vatican as it was: an empire of bloodlines, secrets, and fear. His death didn't end the system, it preserved it, by convincing men the sickness had been purged. But the sickness was not gone. It never left. It simply put the mask back on. 5 centuries have passed since the banquet of chestnuts, yet the echo of fingernails scraping Vatican marble has never stopped. Because the lesson of Alexander VI was not buried with him, it was absorbed, refined, and replicated. The machinery of control he revealed still runs beneath the surface of your world today. Look closely. Do you think power structures ever abandon their most effective weapons? Desire, guilt, fear, obedience, these are eternal currencies. They have only changed costume. Where once men paid indulgences to the Pope, now they pay with endless labor, endless consumption, endless submission to systems that promise salvation in another form: financial security, digital approval, political protection. Where once faith threatened hell, now institutions threaten exile, cancellation, invisibility. The method is the same: control the mind, and the body follows. And still, the inversion continues. Truth is mocked. Lies are sanctified. Pleasure is weaponized. Fear is mass-produced. The world becomes a banquet, and you are placed at the table not as a guest, but as the meal. This is why you were never meant to know the full story of Alexander VI. Because once you see how corruption doesn't destroy systems but strengthens them, once you understand that immorality is not an accident but a design, you stop being controlled. The men who walked into that Vatican chamber on All Hallows' Eve didn't just witness depravity. They witnessed the raw core of power, the ability to turn morality inside out and make people accept it. And here's the truth most men never face: this core of power still governs your world. Look at your leaders. Look at your institutions. Look at the systems demanding your obedience. The mask may have changed, but the hand pulling the strings is the same. So I ask you, will you kneel, or will you awaken? The story of Alexander VI is not a history lesson, it's a mirror. And now you must decide if you'll keep living as the pawn at someone else's banquet, or if you'll walk away from the table and seize the power meant to be yours. Because once you've seen the machine, you can never unsee it. The only question left is, will you remain in its chains, or will you break them?